Hello, this is the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I'm Jeff Cranston, Director of Communications at the Michigan Department of Transportation.
This week, the conversation focuses on I-375 in Detroit and some ambitious plans to rethink that freeway corridor. First, I'll be talking with Margaret Barondess, who manages the environmental section at MDOT and has a well-informed perspective on the process for replacing a freeway with an at-grade boulevard. And in the wake of last weekend's heavy rains and flooding in Detroit, she also talks about why freeways were built below grade and the challenges that presents with increasingly volatile weather caused by climate change. Later, I'll speak with Michigan Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, who spent some of his childhood in the Black Bottom neighborhood, which was greatly disrupted years earlier when I-75 was built.
But first, I want to hear from Margaret because she has the technical knowledge and the background on this kind of thing. So Margaret, tell me, I guess, in highest level terms, what this means to you being able to rethink what is the 375 corridor.
So to me, it's a really exciting opportunity from an environmental impact standpoint to consider past and present contexts and think about the future. And, National Environmental Policy Act is a great process that helps us put all those pieces together and come up with a plan for a transportation facility. And this is the first time in my 30 years here at MDOT that we have been able to look at decommissioning a freeway facility in an urban area. So this presented challenges and opportunities to really look at the past, the present, and the future, and come up with a design that met the needs of transportation, but also the community. And that is really the essence of the National Environmental Policy Act, is balance between transportation needs and community needs and the environmental goals that we have for the natural resources in the area. Because water, for example, as we just heard with some of the flooding in the Detroit area yesterday, and management of water is a very current topic. And I-375 is going to have to manage water in its future iteration with the new project that will go in there too. And we hope to use some best practices in managing that water for the future. So it's about community and natural resources and balancing those with transportation. And that is truly one of the most exciting things about the project, that it is, I think, looking at some very successful balancing of those needs.
Well, and it dovetails nicely because, MDOT has been talking about and working on this to one degree or another for, more than 7 years now. And you've got an administration with President Biden and US DOT Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who are very interested in looking at these kinds of things and, rethinking them, maybe thinking about connectivity that was severed years ago when these freeways were put in, and 375 is almost like a case study in that. But since you mentioned the water and the drainage, which is very much in the news, obviously, after the weekend.
Talk a little bit about that because of your background with the National Environmental Policy Act.
Something you and I touched on around Earth Day on the podcast. What was the reasoning behind building recessed freeways in the first place?
So historically, recessed freeways were looked upon actually as a more urban-friendly type of freeway design, because if you could use retaining walls for your freeway design and pump stations, which would pump water out of a depressed freeway, then you would have less of an impact on the community. So, for example, if you look at some of the more suburban and rural freeway designs, they use ditches to manage water. And, this facility uses underground pipes and pump stations to manage water. And, when we see the flooding, what happens is the pump stations can't keep up with the amount of water that's coming in, and they're collectors for water, these depressed freeways. But historically, and that's why you see so many of them in Detroit, when you built a depressed freeway, you could save costs and impacts because you would have to purchase less property for those types of facilities. The other benefit that a lot of early planners saw with the depressed cross section was that you could kind of keep the city street system somewhat intact when you were building those. You would build the overpass bridges that would connect to the local street grid. And the idea was that less of the traffic impacts, the sounds, the emissions, all the unpleasant things that come with lots of traffic were down below and sort of out of the view of the neighborhood too. So in a way, those were early on, trying to save money, but also they were looked upon as benefit.
Well, I think what we've found out with the, frequency of these weather events, which we knew were going to increase in frequency because of what's going on with the climate. And you're going to have these deluges where more rain comes in a shorter amount of time. That, yeah, it might not matter how many pumps you have and how big they are. There's only so much you can do to move water. And if the creeks and rivers that are the outlets for the water are swollen themselves, there's no place for the water to go. Do you have any sense of how big an issue this is in other parts of the country with recessed freeways? I mean, this can't be unique to Detroit, can it?
So there is something unique about Detroit and our freeway system. Detroit is actually geographically part of the old lake plain for the extensive, water system that we've got here, the Detroit River, Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair. So topographically, Detroit was a low, flat, swampy part of the state. And, you can't take that away very easily when you build a city at that location. So, a lot of flooding depends on your geography and your location. So I think there are probably other cities that have those experiences, but I'm not as familiar with those situations. So I couldn't really say which city, but I would say Detroit has some pretty unique challenges when it comes to water.
Well, as you said, I think restoring this to an at-grade boulevard will present some other drainage challenges, but I think those will be easier to deal with than when you're basically turning these recessed freeways into rivers in these heavy rainstorms. Talk about some of the other advantages of, going back to an urban boulevard and an at-grade street and the opportunities that it creates.
So some of the biggest advantages in going to an at-grade boulevard are really related to how a city functions with respect to mobility and all different types of mobility, including pedestrians, bicyclists. Those are also transit users as well. Because really, when you look at a depressed freeway section, there's not a lot of flexibility in what you can do for other types of modes of transportation because it is set aside just for vehicular traffic. So when you go to an at-grade facility, you have so many more choices with where people can walk, ride bikes, use transit, because you have that mainline facility itself is now open to all those different modes. And you have maybe more choices with respect to cross streets and what you can do with those, because we have to remember bridges are very expensive. So, when you're building a freeway through a city, you think carefully about how many bridges you're going to put and where you're going to put those bridges. But at an at-grade situation, you have a lot more flexibility because everything's on the same level. And so you have reduced costs with respect to looking at how you get people across that road. So that's where your flexibility is. And that is an exciting part of this project too, because it is heavily based upon pedestrian flow, bicycle flow. In fact, one of the components of it is to put in a cycle track, which is basically a dedicated space for bicyclists.
And a protected
Um,
space.
correct. Protected, dedicated space. It's a very safe space for cyclists. So, again, having that extra room because the at grade boulevard takes up less space than a freeway. So this is one of the few projects I've ever worked on where we actually have extra space that is coming out of the project, which is also very exciting because you can look at other uses for that extra space.
Well, and on top of
So
those extra uses, it sounds like, we, you, project managers are talking with Federal Highway about possibly using some of that land for something that honors the history of that area and that neighborhood.
So this project has over 30 acres of excess property. And in my career, I've never seen that happen. Usually we're buying property. We're not, um, getting rid of property, so to speak, here that we don't need for transportation anymore. And so this is very unique for us. And that's quite a bit of space, excess property in an urban environment.
Yeah.
So you're right. You have opportunities for multiple types of purposes. And during public involvement here, people said that they want the story of I-375 and the Black Bottom and Paradise neighborhoods to be told, and that everyone should know what happened with the construction of the freeway and how it affected those neighborhoods. And so we have opportunities to tell that story as well. And when I say we, I mean the community, because it's the community story, and we're here to facilitate the community telling their own story about what has happened there.
Yeah, and we'll hear a little bit of that later from the lieutenant governor, who was obviously not born yet when the freeway was built, but because he spent some of his early childhood in that area, he has a real sense of it and a sense of the history. But what do you think, when you hear these stories, and yet you work, for a Department of Transportation, where people, not you certainly, but people made these decisions 60, 70 years ago, maybe even more so in terms of the planning that went into these things, what they were thinking at the time. I mean, is it as simple as they just wanted to get people from point A to point B, and anything that was in their way, was disregarded? I mean, is it that simple?
I think it's actually pretty complex. I do believe that the interstate system itself was a force to be reckoned with all over the country, in cities everywhere. And in the United States, we made choices with our cities and the interstate system that were often devastating to parts of those cities. And to me, that has to do with a larger societal perspective on what a city is and how a city should function. And that, the beliefs at the time were, in order to keep my city viable, I have to have a freeway in the middle of the city. And especially in Detroit, where, they were showcasing the automobile. So we're going to have the most advanced freeway system in the world here in Wayne County, because we're going to showcase what can happen with these using this technology. And so, Detroit has, again, a very, I think, interesting, unique tie with respect to the automobile industry. Now, what people didn't know were some of the unintended consequences of building these major infrastructure projects through cities. And you see, probably a lack of an awareness there about what was happening. And in some cases, you see some people with potentially good intentions of urban renewal. I see old parts of the city that we need to probably eliminate here. And I'm not going to apologize for, what was happening in the past, because I do think there were some ill intents as well. But I think of it as a pretty complex situation at the time, and reflective of where America was with respect to its cities.
And what our view of development and progress was at the time.
Exactly.
Well, looking forward, if we're able to, we've applied for a RAISE grant, which is a new round of grants that the US DOT is offering to do some planning. The hope, obviously, and the governor talked about this in some media interviews last week, is that this kind of paves the way, puts it higher on the radar of the federal government, and maybe makes it eligible for more federal money so that we can expedite it. I mean, what's your fondest hope, I guess, for this project?
So what I would like to see happen is the project to continue to receive the kind of support it has from our administration and our leadership here at MDOT, to continue that community discussion and dialogue so that the community can really determine priorities and what they want to see happen next on 375. And, we do a lot of that work with NEPA, with the National Environmental Policy Act. But here's a great opportunity to continue that discussion through design, construction, and determining the future for the excess property here. So I would dearly love to see all of the great work that's happened to date in these past 7 years on this project continue on, and the momentum continue on, so we can arrive at infrastructure solutions that are community friendly, and do acknowledge some of the things that have happened in the past, and look for creative approaches through partnerships with the community and other community nonprofit and public-private partnerships to implement some of the things that transportation can do to level the playing field for the community today.
I think that's great. Thank you, Margaret. I'm sure we'll be talking more about this, and I look forward to following the progress with you. And I will be back with Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist. Okay, once again, we're back to talk about I-375 and MDOT's plans to restore an urban boulevard there and get rid of the freeway that is, acknowledged by many as a major mistake some 60 years ago. And I'm pleased to have with me Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, who was along for the NBC interview and story on the corridor last week with Mayor Duggan and our director, Paul Adjuba, and the governor. Thanks for taking time to do this.
Jeff, thank you for having me. It was good to be here with you, and it was good to be there. I grew up the first half of my childhood in the Black Bottom neighborhood where 375 was built, and that it really bisected and destroyed. And so this is really great that our state is making this statement of values, that we want to invest in this community in a new way and to restore what's been lost.
Well, that's really interesting. So what are your earliest perceptions? I mean, given that you're, much younger than the freeway, your earliest perceptions of that freeway, and when did the history of that neighborhood really get on your radar?
When I was a child, like super young, I was made aware of my parents, my neighbors. They told me about, what happened when 375 came there, that it didn't have to go there, but that when it was placed there, what it displaced 60 years ago, displacing, hundreds of Black-owned businesses, displacing, what really it was our Black Wall Street. We talk about what happened in Tulsa and Black Wall Street there, that Black Bottom was our Black Wall Street here in Detroit and here in Michigan. So from a very, very, very young age, I'm talking 4 or 5 years old, I was aware of that history. And so now I'm very proud that as Lieutenant Governor of the state, as someone who is a son of that community, to be able to make this statement of values to the federal government in a way that's aligned with our president and vice president, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, who want to invest in communities and create not just equitable access to opportunity, but frankly, to create equitable access to prosperity in a way that pays homage to the community that was lost.
That's really interesting that you talk about as a Black Wall Street, because it really was the epicenter of the Black middle class in Detroit, and probably therefore in Michigan.
And you should go a step further than that. So, for a lot of Black people around the country, actually, Detroit, Michigan was the place that they came, and for the first time, they saw Black folks who had wealth. And so a lot of those Black folks lived in that community. And so it really represents a lot. And, this is about, what the governor and I are trying to do across the board, which is create equitable access to economic opportunity, to position the people of Michigan to have a chance at success, whether that is reclaiming a heritage and building a prosperous future on top of that, or just reducing barriers for people to be their best selves. That's what we're all about.
So Jupiter kind of aligned with Mars for us because while this has been talked about for a few years, it's been a bit stalled. The funding is always a problem. We're talking in the range of $300 million to do this right. But having a president come along and a secretary of transportation in Pete Buttigieg and say, this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about equity and we talk about connectivity. And I mean, it just really couldn't have come at a better time.
Well, that's what I mean when I say an alignment of values with President Biden and Vice President Harris, with Secretary Buttigieg. They've made clear that the way that we should be directing federal resources is to create, sort of catalytic opportunities to create equity in our communities. And that's exactly what 375 represents. And us applying for this USDOT RAISE grant, we don't get a chance to make many of these kind of applications. We only get to apply for like 3 every year. And our administration, the Whitmer Gilchrist administration, is choosing to ask the federal government to partner with us on this project because it's the right thing to do. And because we believe in the economic potential and vitality of this community. And we want to build it back better.
So definitely our hope in pursuing this RAISE grant is that we can get some money for the planning, but it's going to signal viability to the federal government. And they're going to say, okay, this is something we've already invested in. So let's invest more and really make this happen and expedite it and get it over the finish line. Many people can't get past lamenting the troubling history, which is understandable. But at the same time, nothing the city or state could do would undo those past mistakes. So you and the governor and the department are acknowledging that past and doing what you can, I guess, to explore the ways to restore the opportunity and vibrancy there. But what do you think when you hear people say, well, nothing's going to bring it back? I mean, that's true, right? Nothing is going to bring it back the way it was, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do something.
Intention is not resurrection. The intention is respect and then reimagination. So the idea of can we invest in the potential of the people of this community so that it doesn't need to be exactly what it was, because that was 60 years ago. But what is the version of that vibrant community today? I'm not just here to mark something historically. We're here to build something for the future that's inclusive and that is representative of that heritage. And that's what we can do. And that's what, this kind of grant will, as you said, demonstrate the viability of this project. And we will have a very, vibrant and enthusiastic set of community conversations about what this can look like and what this community can be. And that's what's exciting to me.
Well said. And the federal government, the Federal Highway Administration signals some flexibility and cooperation in terms of doing a memorial there or some kind of museum, something to honor the past. I know that's really important to people. And that's unusual for, a DOT to be able to do something like that. So I think this could be a real model for the rest of the country.
Well, I mean, again, that would be nice. And I think they have said there's some interest in that and that should happen. That just can't be the extent of it. And so I think what our residents will be looking for is how we leverage this opportunity. This is going to be a generational investment in this community. And it's how we can make sure that we are enabling all the people with ideas who live in the community, all those with heritage here, to be able to see themselves in the future of this community, not just to relish the past.
Do you have any specific thoughts on what you might want to see there?
I think that it's really up for the people who are there now to decide. So, I just want to make sure that the process that we go through is one that lands in a place where we get something that is truly enabling, like whether that's enabling, again, that we have so many people who are so entrepreneurial. Black Bottom, again, was a business haven. How can we have another, district of Black entrepreneurs and diverse entrepreneurs who are putting their ideas into the world in that part of Detroit? That would be really exciting and really inspiring. And I know that coupling and reconnecting that neighborhood with downtown Detroit, there's some really exciting opportunities that can come from that when that boulevard is done right. So I'm just eager to see what the people come up with.
So you think that sounds different, not contradictory necessarily, but different from rebuilding Michigan and the aggressive bonding plan to rebuild the freeways and bridges that are falling apart, to take a freeway out and restore it as an urban boulevard. But actually, that's also fixing something. It's fixing another problem, right?
Well, the way that I see it, it's all connected, because what rebuilding Michigan represents is how do we make sure this infrastructure is enabling for people to be able to do what they need to do from a commerce perspective, from a connection and relationship perspective. And so that all is under this same category here. So whether it is filling in a freeway or fixing a bridge, all of it is about preparing Michigan's infrastructure to go into the future. in a better way.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I appreciate it. And I think we'll have more opportunities to talk about this as time goes on. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Jeff. And thank you to all the entire MDOT team, our MDOT employees that I see every day are courageous, are intelligent, are productive, and I'm proud to work alongside them.
Thank you again for listening to this week's edition of the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I would like to thank Randy Dubler and Corey Peaty for engineering this week's podcast. To subscribe to show notes and more, go to Apple Podcasts and search for Talking Michigan Transportation.